how to turn on the video feed. Do you know how to do that?
Yeah, in the upper right corner, see the video camera?
Okay.
It's right next to the microphone.
Okay. There was a icon that was disguising that. Okay.
There he is.
Is that good? Hi, Janet. Hi.
Hi, David.
Hi, Todd.
Hey, David.
Hello, everyone.
All right. So, exciting roundtable we have here.
Indeed.
Definitely.
All right. Let me just
We'll start in a couple of minutes.
Okay. I'm going to just shut off my mail so I don't keep getting beeped.
Saeed, I see there's a couple of people in the main lobby, Daniel Kruger and Mel. Are they stuck there?
I don't think so. They can just click on the Roundtable series room.
Okay.
All right. Turn off the phone.
Okay, I guess we can start. I'd like to say hello to everyone and welcome back everyone to the HBS Virtual Roundtable series. I'm Saeed Rezvai-Nejad, a psychology grad student and one of the organizers of the series, along with Courtney Crosby at the University of Texas, Christopher Smith at the Washington State University, and Paul Dutchman at Boston College. Before we start, I'd like to thank Corinna Pacella at the University of Pennsylvania, Chris Van Ruden at the University of Richmond, and student representative Carrie Pick at the Arizona State University for proposing this series, the Executive Council of HBS for their support, and Nicole Barbaro for her help advertising the series. Because this is an HBS-sponsored meeting, please note that this meeting is subjected to the HBS Code of Conduct, which has been shared in the chat. In general, we ask people to be respectful and professional to one another during the event. We also encourage audience participation throughout the event. If you have any questions, please use the question box on the bottom right of the screen. Please keep your questions short and precise, and please feel free to upvote any questions that you would like to see answered. And finally, everything is being recorded and will be posted publicly on YouTube after the event. Today, we'll focus on sexual jealousy and intimate partner violence. Moderating our event today is Dr. Elizabeth Pillsworth. Elizabeth is a professor of anthropology at the California State University at Fullerton. Elizabeth, please, the session is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Saeed, and thank you, organizers, for putting this together. I'm really excited for us to have this roundtable. First, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I will go in order that they're on the couch. So we have Dr. Janet Howard, who is a research associate in the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at the University of Bristol. Welcome, Janet. Janet, I'm going to ask each of you to just give us a very brief, we're going to get into questions about your research, but a very brief introduction of how your work relates to our theme of sexual jealousy and intimate partner violence.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for having me and for the introduction. So I'm interested in behaviors which seem sort of counterintuitive from an evolutionary point of view. So behaviors in which individuals appear to be damaging the health and well-being of their relatives, their family members, and which therefore might jeopardize their own evolutionary fitness, but which are actually found in quite high prevalence in many populations. So I'm interested in examining whether evolutionary theory can explain this high prevalence. And the two behaviors which I've looked at most in detail are female genital cutting and intimate partner violence. And primarily I've used large demographic data sets in sub-Saharan Africa to answer these questions, although I'm currently involved in a project in Ethiopia where we're looking at how your social network, the members of your social network, affect your attitude towards female genital cutting.
Thank you. Welcome. Next, we have Dr. David Buss, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Texas in Austin and has the evolutionary psychology lab there, where I'm pleased to say several of our master's graduates, or a few of our master's graduates, have gone on to do work. David, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work with this topic.
Okay, well, I think probably most people are familiar with my work on jealousy, some of which I did with Todd Shackelford, another panelist here. But my broad interest in this topic is part of a broader interest in conflict between the sexes. And so I recently published a book called When Men Behave Badly, The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault. And within that book, there's one chapter devoted to intimate partner violence, but the forms of conflict, of sexual conflict that emerge when we talk about that spill over into other realms. So I also have a chapter on stalking, for example, which occurs in mating relationships and in the aftermath of breakups. So what just to end that, one of the key issues is, I think, does intimate partner violence have an adaptive logic? That is, do people who use intimate partner violence deploy it to solve very predictable adaptive problems associated with sexual conflict, which is the ways in which men and women manipulate, influence, and torture each other as they go through life? And then also, what are the psychological mechanisms in victims of intimate partner violence that get hijacked by perpetrators of intimate partner violence? So that's really what the focus of my chapter is on those two key themes.
Excellent. Thank you. Todd Shackelford, Dr. Todd Shackelford, professor of psychology at Oakland University. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, yes, thank you, Elizabeth, and I'm delighted to be here with Janet and David, and I'm happy to see that we've got and it's increasing, the number of people who have joined us. So a lot of my work does overlap with much of David's work, but also with some of Janet's work, and I'll note that I mean, I've done a lot of work on intimate partner violence in particular, and on intimate partner homicide, but one of the ways in which I've spent a lot of my time over the last, few years is looking specifically at sexual coercion and rape in the context of intimate relationships, which is, clearly it's a sort of violence, but it's a very specialized, a different sort of violence that I think it's very interesting, and I think there are a lot of questions that remain about how to understand intimate partner sexual coercion or rape in the context of intimate relationships. So thank you again for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Well, welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. So one of the things that I'd like to do, just to set the stage of where we're going to go with this discussion, is I think in this group, the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, we're all on the same page that jealousy and intimate partner violence are the products of natural selection. They serve as adaptations that, as all of you mentioned, should follow an adaptive logic. So I'm going to take that as our baseline and our assumption, and we won't hash out too much whether or not that's true. What I'd rather have us do is talk about the details of how these mechanisms will function. And in particular, I'd like to think about the predictors. So what are the contextual factors that lead to both jealousy and violence? So David mentioned that this is about intersexual conflict. What predicts these conflicts in terms of individual traits, individual variation, contextual factors, and social factors? And then I'd like to also unpack and talk about the range of responses to these jealousy-provoking contexts. So, Janet, you mentioned that you are looking at intimate partner violence, and Todd, you talked about homicide. but also sexual coercion. And David, you also talked about manipulating victims psychologically. There's a whole suite of violent behaviors. We can talk about physical violence and sexual violence and psychological violence, and all of those likely respond to different predictors and will be more likely and more useful from an adaptive sense in different contexts. So I'd like to talk about what patterns we would expect to see and what patterns people are seeing in the data. But I'd also like to, when we have that conversation, talk about the full range of mate retention tactics that David and Todd have laid out quite thoroughly in multiple publications, because intimate partner violence is not the only potential response to sexual conflict or jealousy invoking context. So I'd like to talk about what tips the needle towards violence as opposed to more benefit conferring strategies. So that's something else I'd like us to put on the table. And then finally, I'd like to get to talking about victim responses and counter adaptations to intimate partner violence. So that's in general where I'd like to take the conversation, if that's okay with everybody. And with that, I'm going to start, Janet. I know you have some recent data looking at testing two different explanations for intimate partner violence: the paternity certainty model and what some have called the let me find where it's called, the sexual conflict, but sorry, I just lost my words. It's very early.
Paternal disinvestment.
Thank you. Paternal disinvestment model. Thank you. Could you describe a little bit of that, what those are, what different patterns we would expect to see, and what you've actually found in your data?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I was, I think the context in which I work is quite different from David and Todd. I primarily look at, low middle income countries, and I'm interested in the variation in IPV in different contexts, and sort of would anticipate that IPV behavior will vary according to the different social and cultural and economic and a whole range of cultural contexts that a person might be living in. And I would also say that, the data does show that there are a lot of contextual factors like alcohol use, poverty, education, social acceptability of violence in the community, attitudes towards IPV, which are all shown to be strongly predictive of whether or not men perpetrate IPV in those contexts. And but in that situation, I was interested that very few people have looked at the different types of violence and whether there are different triggers for sexual or physical violence. And I guess that's partly because from a sort of eradication point of view, people just want to look at ways of understanding the data and eradicating the behavior. And maybe the importance from that point of view is less, the distinction between the different types of behavior is of less importance. But nevertheless, I was interested to see if there are different triggers specifically for sexual and physical violence. In this particular study, I was not looking at the psychological side, so it was just physical or sexual. And as you said, yes, I looked at the testing these different evolutionary theories. And so controlling for all the contextual factors, which I just described, the socioeconomic and attitude towards violence in the community, I then added in different variables to test the paternity certainty hypothesis, which was the number of sexual partners that a woman had had and whether they were in a polygamous marriage, and other indicators of which might lead a man to be concerned about his paternity. And the results showed that both sexual and physical violence were predicted by those variables. I also looked at the paternal disinvestment model, which is where a kind of idea that women are concerned or that conflict in the relationship is caused when men start to look for alternative reproductive opportunities outside of the pair bond. So they might look at a concurrent relationship. They might be looking at terminating their current relationship and finding a different partner, or they could be looking at a polygamous, a second wife, a third wife, or so. So looking at those sorts of indicators, those seem to be strongly predictive only of physical violence and not of sexual violence. So it seemed that those conflicts, which are indicative of a man wanting to leave the pair bond, might trigger physical violence between the couple rather than sexual violence.
Thank you. And I want to connect that with Todd. You had some data when you said you were looking at homicide in particular that found differences between the relationship status of the couple. So married versus cohabiting versus dating. And that sounds like it might fit in somewhat to what Janet was talking about these different features that might predict paternity, IPV in relation to paternity certainty versus paternal disinvestment. Could you describe a little bit of what you found with those data?
Sure. And this is in several different data sets. So one was the Chicago Police Department homicide data set, and then also an FBI Universal Crime Reports data set. And we found repeatedly now that that there's a greater risk of death to women, but also to men in cohabiting versus marital relationships. And that's been found repeatedly by other researchers, although recently, I think maybe the last 5 or 6 years ago, Martin Daly and one of his co-authors failed to replicate this result in an updated, I think it was an FBI or a Canadian data set. So there is a failure to replicate, but in the context of 12 or 15 studies that have found this effect, I mean, I'm open to the possibility that it's no longer holding true. But what generally has been found is that couples who are in cohabiting relationships are basically at greater risk of intimate partner violence and of intimate partner homicide. And again, it's true for both men and women, although the rates are higher, of course, for women. And nobody has really explained this effectively. I mean, we've offered speculations that, you know, maybe cohabitation is in part sort of processed as a cue to a relative lack of commitment to the relationship. It might also be processed by close relatives as a relative lack of commitment to a relationship. So there may be fewer people that a woman who's being abused, for example, physically abused by her partner, can rely on to sort of to get help. But at any rate, we have found this in several different data sets, and it's not been, you know, sort of fully explained.
Yeah, I mean, it's puzzling in some ways, because if we think about it as, I mean, so the motivation for violence in that context, I mean, do you think it's more related to a sort of paternity certainty concern, or is this about coercion of getting a woman committed? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it may be some of both. I mean, it may be that just from the man's perspective, just taking the case of men's violence against women, both non-lethal and lethal. Well, maybe I'll just stick with non-lethal for now. But it may be that men are sort of responding to, you know, what they perceive as lesser commitment on the part of the woman to the relationship, and therefore a greater likelihood of infidelity, for example. But I think there's also something to be said for the social sort of social signals of, you know, marital status, formal status. I mean, it's also true that cohabiting couples tend to be younger than do married couples,
right,
on average. And so there's various, you know, confounding factors. They also tend to be less educated. I mean, so there's various confounding factors, but my sense is that it's men sort of responding to a potential cue to, or a signal to potential infidelity on the part of his partner. And I must say that women's violence against their partners and women's homicide of their partners very often can be attributed to male sexual jealousy, either in defense of, you know, a violent partner, or, you know, in defense of children with that violent partner. I think there's clearly an asymmetry in the perpetration.
Thank you for bringing that up, because actually that was something else that was on my list of things I wanted to talk about, is the sex differences. So we know there's an enormous sex difference in the rates of engaging in intimate partner violence, but you just brought up the different predictors of what leads to partner violence as well. So I'd like to come back to that issue maybe in a few minutes as well. So Todd, with the data that you were just talking about, that was all physical violence up to and including homicide. There was a study that I was looking at recently, Meekers et al. In 2013 in Bolivia, that found a slightly different pattern. They didn't see any difference in physical violence between married versus dating, but they found a difference in psychological violence. And I'm going to actually ask David to talk about this perhaps. And what they found was the opposite pattern, that psychological violence was more common in marital, that I think, than dating relationships. No, psychological violence was more common in dating than marital relationships. So David, could you talk to us a little bit about the role of psychological violence and what purpose that might serve, and is it different from physical violence?
Yeah, interesting question. So I guess what I would first do is I think it would be helpful to kind of lay out some of the broader conceptual space that we're talking about here, that Janet and Todd have been talking about, and I think we can zoom in and zoom out, if you will, conceptually. And so I'll get to your immediate question, but I just wanted to kind of lay out what I see as the broader map of these issues. So both Janet and Todd, I think, were absolutely correct in making a distinction between physical violence and sexual violence within these mating relationships, because those might serve somewhat different functions. I would say even at a more granular level, I would distinguish between different forms of physical violence. So, for example, there is some evidence, and I talk about this in the chapter in the book, and Josh Duntley and I talk about it in our article on intimate partner violence, that when a woman gets pregnant, especially if there's a suspicion that the pregnancy is by another man, he has a much higher probability of engaging in physical violence that is directed toward the abdomen of the female, where I think the hypothesized function would be literally the termination of that fetus, and that's a very different function, than physical violence that's designed to deter a woman from breaking up or having sex with someone else. So I think even within physical violence, we have to make some important distinctions. Panning back out, at a broader level, there's one, the way that I think about it is that there are a couple of things that are at issue. One is that predictable optima from a fitness standpoint, ancestrally recurrent fitness context, there are different fitness optima between males and females in certain domains, and that there is going to be conflict whenever there are these different fitness optima. And so in one kind of a jaded sense, one can view when a man and a woman get together in a mating context, they pool their resources, and I think it's important to note there are high levels of cooperation often between mating relationships, and we're talking about conflict within the context of often high levels of cooperation. But there are different fitness optima. So, for example, just hypothetically, it might be in the best interest of either partner to manipulate the other or influence the other to, let's say, devote all their resources to child rearing. So that frees up the other partner to pursue other avenues of fitness, such as status acquisition or additional mate acquisition, which was alluded to earlier. I think Janet first raised that issue with the paternity disinvestment hypothesis. And so one expects this kind of internecine warfare, if you will, of manipulation, influence, counter manipulation, and so forth. So I think that there's benefit to looking at the more granular levels of this. But when it comes to intimate partner violence and sexual violence, I think that there's also a commonality if we pan back out, and that is bypassing female choice.
Right.
So if we regard, once you have the evolution of sexual reproduction, 1 to 2 billion years ago, you have the evolution of female choice, as Darwin called it. We know now with humans, there's male choice and female choice, but sexual violence is a form of bypassing female choice. Intimate partner violence is a form of bypassing female choice. It's an attempt to coerce the female to be, to monopolize all of her reproductive resources rather than divert those to alternative males. And so I think we have to both pan in and look at the more granular level of this conceptual space, but also look at some of these broader themes of different fitness optima and issues of bypassing female choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And so taking that step back and thinking about this in terms of bypassing female choice actually leads me again back to this question of the different kinds of violence too, because so psychological violence, and we can talk about things like making women feel bad about themselves, making them uncertain, making them scared, making them doubt themselves. All of those things, that also we can think of it as an attempt to bypass female choice, but we also might think of it as an attempt to alter female choice or alter female preferences. So rather than bypassing it, changing it, which I think also ties into when we talk about the mate retention tactics. And again, we haven't brought in that full spectrum of the benefit conferring tactics, where I think we might think about that not so much in forcefully bypassing female choice, but in trying to change females' choices or preferences. So could you maybe speak to that a little bit as to what you see in terms, especially psychological violence, because we haven't really talked about that much.
Yeah, I see that is really on a continuum with physical violence. And in the studies that I've done on married couples, where one of the first studies we did was we did a factor analysis of all the different ways in which couples get into conflict. We came up with 15 factors, but the verbal abuse, so a guy insulting a woman's appearance, telling her that she's fat, telling her that she's ugly, these sorts of forms of verbal abuse loaded on the same factor as physical abuse, and so I think that there's some way in which they serve similar functions or even the same functions, that is designed to manipulate the female, but designed to manipulate her in very specific ways. So for example, insulting her physical appearance. You're ugly, you're fat. Well, we know that physical appearance is a very important quality in men's mate selection criteria. And consequently, it's an important criterion in women's self-evaluation of their own mate value. And so I think that, one of the predictors is a mate value discrepancy. So when the function would be the man's attempt to lower the woman's self-perception of her own mate value so that she thinks she can't do better elsewhere. And one of the things that we know, I think we know this about intimate partner violence, and I suspect that it's also true of this form of emotional or psychological violence that you're talking about, Elizabeth, that it has predictable effects. One, lowering the woman's self-esteem. People don't feel good about themselves when they're being abused, and to some degree, self-esteem is a self-assessment monitoring mechanism in part of mate value. It's a monitoring mechanism of other things, but mate value is one of them. And so lowering the woman's self-perceptions of her mate value is one function, I think, of both. So I guess sort of in long-winded answer to your question is I see the functions as either the same or very similar when it comes to psychological violence. But again, it depends on what do we mean by psychological violence. There are forms like and you asked us to broaden our discussion of mate retention tactics. we found things, Todd and I found things like, inducing guilt in a partner, pretending to be hurt or angry so that the partner feels guilty. Well, is that psychological violence? Well, it's a form of psychological manipulation. Do we want to call that violence? Well, that's probably qualitatively different than insulting the woman's attractiveness. But they're both forms of psychological manipulation, if you will. And I think even physical violence is a form of psychological manipulation. Mm-hmm. And often, anyway, I've gone on at too great a length. I have more things to say about this, but I want to let Janet and Todd weigh in on these issues.
Yes, please. So actually, I want to ask Janet, I know you said you haven't collected data on any forms of emotional or psychological violence yet, but do you have any thoughts about this in the populations where you work in Western Africa?
Yeah, so I think there is, I think this is one of the outstanding questions, and there's still a lot to learn about this, about whether, there's this continuum. I think we might assume there's a continuum where it goes from psychological to physical with sexual violence, and maybe at the most extreme. But actually, we don't really know that for sure. And we kind of, would need longitudinal data to over a number of years to see if that progression does actually manifest, or if there are different triggers which might result in the more extreme forms of behavior coming out. Sexual violence may be a complete outlier. It might have, in the data that I've been looking at, there are women who experience sexual violence but don't report experiencing any physical violence. So it's not necessarily the two always go together. And I think David's right in that it's these behaviors are quite difficult to measure, particularly the psychological factors. So there is data in these data sets on whether a woman has been made to feel ashamed by her husband, if she's been made to feel bad, whether they've argued, those kind of ideas. But what the definition of when that becomes violence or coercive behavior, as opposed to it just being part of a marital life, it's quite difficult. It's quite nuanced, isn't it? And I think there is a difficulty in understanding at what point how many repeat episodes make it violence or coercion, as opposed to it just being a difficult relationship. And I think the same with physical violence. Often, if a woman says that she has experienced one episode of physical violence in the past 12 months or something, that's categorized as violence, but that doesn't capture the nuance of the frequency and the severity, and I think that is one of the challenges that remains in this field, is to try and have a different way of capturing, instead of a binary yes or no, somehow taking into account the longitudinal aspect of it and the frequency.
Yeah, and I think also what you talked about before, and what David also talked about with the data on specific kinds of violence. So if we really take it back, zoom back in to that really granular level, we can think about different patterns of what kinds of tactics are used for what purposes. So sexual violence, you said, that is predicted by cues that would be related to paternity uncertainty, whereas it was not predicted by cues that were related to paternal disinvestment. Mm-hmm. And we might think the same with some of these emotional or psychological violent tactics. So, for example, David, when you were talking about attacking a woman's physical appearance or her mate value, might that be, I don't know if that would be more predictive of something that we would see in a paternal disinvestment strategy versus an ensuring paternal certainty strategy. You could see it potentially being used for both.
Well, I would say, I would add, in one sense, men try to monopolize all of the woman's reproductively relevant resources. And so, at some level, these are attempts to do that. And I think even the disinvestment, I'm a little stuck on that label, because, one of the things that we know is kind of, as you alluded to, and I think Janet might have also alluded to this, is that men often try to add additional partners rather than jettison one partner. And so that is, they try to monopolize not just their primary partner's reproductively relevant resources, but other partners' reproductively relevant resources.
And try and stop their current partners from impeding that. I think is, at the core of the paternal disinvestment model is the idea that, you want to keep the current partner and her investment, but you don't want her to keep you from obtaining other opportunities. Todd, do you want to weigh in on this topic of psychological violence?
Yeah, I have one comment. I think it is useful to distinguish physical violence from psychological violence from sexual violence. At the same time, I mean, the work that we've done, and this is mostly with, younger, 20s and 30s for the most part, people in the United States. I mean, we find very high correlations between the infliction of physical violence, sexual violence, and psychological violence. And there are, in fact, many different ways to assess each of these. I mean, there are standardized instruments for assessing psychological violence and sexual violence and physical violence, trying to separate them conceptually. And yet the correlations are consistently, positive and sometimes very high, especially between sexual violence and physical violence. And you have to be careful, obviously, to not just utterly confound the two dimensions. But generally, it is the case that they're highly correlated. And it occurred to me as well that, there's, even within psychological violence, there are measures, we developed a measure, it's a decent measure of partner-directed insults. So the insulting things that women report that their partners say to them. And then we, developed this measure that, breaks it down into 10 or 12 factors of insults or something to that effect. So anyways, that's really getting into the granularity of things. And it's not surprisingly, there are sort of predictable dimensions that fall out of this. Things like insulting her physical attractiveness, insulting her sexual fidelity, insulting her intelligence and her prospects for mateship. But I also wanted to just circle back around. You've mentioned a couple of times, Elizabeth, about the other, maybe you don't want to shift to this topic, but I just wanted to remind us that you did mention issues of benefit provisioning. There are other ways to retain a mate besides, physically beating her or, psychologically manipulating her. And David and I and others have done work, on, for example, expressions of love and care, or, investing time, effort, energy, and resources as sort of a signal of commitment to the relationship. There are also some pretty good predictors of who's likely to use what types. We know that access to resources is pretty good, or lack of access to resources is a reasonably good predictor of the use of physical violence. That is, of cost-inflicting sorts of mate retention tactics versus the use of benefit provisioning. In some sense, if you don't have, the resources to provision, well, then you're sort of potentially left with, physical threat or psychological manipulation.
Actually, I would very much like to follow along that line. I was planning on sort of leaving that for later, but
Sorry.
No, it's great. I would actually love to talk about it. This is the thing that to me is, that's been banging around in my head the whole time that since we started talking about having this roundtable. And it is this question of, so one of my lab members asked me to pose the question to all of you as well as to whether or not there are applied uses of our evolutionary insights in terms of things like policy. And so I want to follow that up. I want to use that to sort of set the stage in thinking about these benefit provisioning tactics, because we talk about these predictors of whether a man is likely to use coercive tactics or more encouragement tactics. Are there predictors at sort of an socio-environmental level that can shift those strategies, make them so we think in terms of costs and benefits, right? And so the idea is, what makes violence more costly so that provisioning or benefit provisioning tactics are more beneficial to men?
Yeah, I could say a couple things about that. One is, and I'm almost reluctant to raise this issue, but patriarchal laws. So one of the things that I try to do in the book is what they call, I think Daniel Dennett invented this term, but I'm not 100% sure, steel manning the opposition's arguments. So if you go to gender studies groups, departments, say at my university, they will tell you, what is the cause of intimate partner violence? Patriarchy.
Right.
And then you ask, well, what do you mean by patriarchy? And they say, well, everyone knows patriarchy. That's the explanation. So, but of course, it's a kind of, as just invoked as a label, doesn't really clarify anything or identify any causal variables. Okay, but if you steel man the argument and say, well, there are actually things that you could call patriarchal laws. So it is perfectly permissible legally in some cultures to take a stick and beat a mate, to physically abuse a mate with impunity. In the United States, it is currently illegal in all 50 states, but even those laws are relatively recent. So I think there are legal things, and people are to some degree responsive to legal things. If you're going to get thrown in jail for doing something, then that's an issue. Then there are, and this gets to another issue, which I think, Elizabeth, you are going to get to later on, is women's defenses. Mm-hmm. And one of the things A.J. Figueiredo discovered is proximity of kin. Right. The closer the proximity of the kin, that's going to deter physical violence. If a woman's got, 3 brothers and a high status father or whatever, he's going to be more reluctant to beat up the wife. And this even shows up in movies like The Godfather, where Sonny goes and, threatens the husband of his sister and says, if you ever touch her, I'm going to kill you. So there's the proximity of kin, which is, I think, important. And that in turn gets to the issue of mismatches between ancestral and modern conditions, as well as women's defenses against intimate partner violence. And I think one of the most important defenses is bodyguards, and over evolutionary time, that would have been one of the most important defenses. And this even shows up cross-culturally when, when you have mating systems that are exogamous versus endogamous. So whether the woman stays with, it gets exported to the husband's kin group or stays with her own genetic relatives. And women, in the ethnographies, say express fear about getting exported to the husband because they will be stripped of their bodyguard. So I think in terms of women's defenses, bodyguards have been absolutely critical, and these involve more than just kin. They involve female allies mm-hmm. and male allies as well. But this gets back to one of the functions of intimate partner violence. Is one of the things that men do is they try to cut off the relationships between the woman and her family and her friends. That is the guy that one of the functions is to try to deprive her of the bodyguards that she has in their environment. So I think all of these issues are related. That is an element of the social context, a mismatch between ancestral and modern environments, women's defenses against intimate partner violence.
Yeah, and this relates to a question that somebody posted in the comments, which is related to the mismatch issue, asking, is it fair to say that in our evolutionary past, couples were less able to be private than at present, and thus the current environment might have changed the prevalence of intimate partner violence? Janet, what do you think about that? Again, working in other kinds of communities than just here in the US.
Yeah, I mean, in the global public health literature, if you were looking at, you were asking your lab was talking about how these ideas could be applied to sort of work on policies and programs to reduce IPV. I think that was your kind of idea, wasn't it? I mean, alcohol use is, is nothing to do necessarily with evolutionary, but the main risk of IPV comes from some of those, factors that are nothing to do with the topics that we're talking about, actually. And in the global health literature, they talk about ecological model where people look at the factors, the individual factors, both the man and the women, like their experience of adverse childhood experiences and what they've learned as a normal behavior within a couple in their childhood, the individual, and then you look at the couple dynamics. Then you would look more widely at the social and the community norms and the social sanctions against intimate partner violence, as well as the social acceptance of using intimate partner violence. And then, as David was talking, then you look at the next layer, which is the national context in which many countries in sub-Saharan Africa there is no legislation against IPV, and so that's obviously going to set the stage. So you've got these sort of different layers: the individual, the couple, the community, the national situation, which all interact and feed into whether the likelihood of IPV occurring in a community. And as everyone's been saying, IPV is a very costly strategy. It does come with a lot of costs, and a pair bond is a stable unit for a man to be bringing up his offspring, and I think the having some sort of universal idea, it very much depends on the context in which the woman and couple are living, and the expectations are on them in terms of the parental investment that might be required in that, the normal amount of paternal investment in the community, or the availability of alternative mates, the sex ratio in the community. And I think, all these factors might be predictive of whether IPV is a sort of strategy that a man might go to in those contexts.
So I'd like to just ask a couple of clarifying questions about the populations in Western Africa where female genital cutting is still practiced. Can you characterize that at all in terms of things like matrilocality versus patrolocality, what kind of access women have to their kin networks, whether or not that is, I know we're not really talking about female genital cutting per se, but whether access to kin networks is a buffer against intimate partner violence, or where the families, what their role is, I guess.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I don't think there's been any. So obviously, female genital cutting is typically done in childhood by the girl's family would decide for that to happen to a daughter. And so the kin are directly involved in that decision. Whether there's any protection against IPV, depending on whether women are living close to their family or not, I don't know. I mean, in many of those communities, women marry out and don't live near their kin network. But I don't think there have been any studies on that particular aspect of IPV or sanctions against IPV.
Yeah, because I do work in the Amazon, and my colleague John Patton works in a very closely related indigenous population, but where he works with the Achuar, there's matrilocality, and where I work, there's temporary matrilocality. It's mostly patrilocal. So we do see some very big differences in women's strategies and who they can call upon, and this issue of bodyguards that David was talking about, having a support network around you, somebody that you can turn to. But to go back to this question, and I think, Todd, this might relate a little bit. You talked about that marriage versus dating in terms of relationship stability, but do you think this issue that was posed in the question here about privacy, do you think there's any connection with that? So first of all, I guess, do we think it's true that in the ancestral past, people had less privacy, and would that make intimate partner violence less likely if everybody's got their noses in everybody's business? Are we creating an opportunity for violence when we create these sort of closed households that nobody peeks into? What do you think about that?
Well, I guess my thought is it's an empirical question, but it does seem to me that the the risk of intimate partner violence is, I mean, I would be surprised, and maybe I'll just be surprised, but I would be surprised if the rate was not higher in nuclear family sorts of arrangements where there is very little contact or much less frequent contact with, with other family members, and where life is generally lived somewhat more privately, maybe a lot more privately. So, I mean, that's my thought, although I'm not aware of any work specifically investigating that. I think it's a very interesting question, though. Maybe Janet or David can say something.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
I remember once having a conversation with, do you know Jonathan Stieglitz, who's done some work on IPV in the Shamane? And he said in the Shamane there that there are open huts. I don't think there are even walls on the huts. It's a kind of roof and a structure. And IPV rates are relatively, I can't remember the rate that he recorded, but it definitely does take place quite a lot, despite the fact that there seems to be absolutely no privacy whatsoever. And I think he was saying, he was living in that community for a while doing the research, but never observed or overheard anything. So it was a kind of that's just an interesting anecdotal story that speaks to what you're talking about.
Yeah, the rates in the Chumani are very high, as I recall. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Shagnon also reports it among the Yanomamo, and I think that this gets into the issue of what are the social norms around that, and in many cultures it's viewed as permissible, and in modern culture, Western culture, it's not permissible, and so I think we have to talk about social norms to some degree, although it's a really fascinating question, this issue of mismatch. And Elizabeth, I think you're right on the privacy issue. My guess from reading the ethnographies is that intimate partner violence was prevalent even in these more public contexts. So as you mentioned, as Janet has mentioned, however, on the current private thing, I think that even that's changing now with iPhones. So people are, recording their partner's abuse, taking selfies of their bruises and so forth, and letting their social network know. And so I think we're actually seeing a move toward more public information dispersal. Although it is also true, and we haven't talked about this, women often conceal their violence. So that is, they put on, they refuge. That is, they don't leave their house. If they do, they put on sunglasses and makeup and scarves to cover up the bruises and so forth. And this gets into an issue that Daniel Sneeser has talked about a lot, which is the emotion of shame, which he argues is an emotion that is designed to, in part, prevent social devaluation. And when a woman, I think the unfortunate irony of this situation is that this is one of the ways in which the men who commit the violence parasitize or hijack female psychology, because not only does she feel bad about herself, lower her perceptions of her own mate value, but also feels shame. The shame causes her to refuge more, which in turn deprives her of the bodyguards and social allies that she otherwise could recruit. And so it's all quite diabolical.
It is, and it fits, as you said, as Todd said, that there's these strong correlations between psychological, sexual, and physical violence, and in part there's strong correlations because, as you said, they are already correlated. If a woman feels, if she is physically violated, she also feels shame and has that experience, psychological experience. But I'm gonna, and I'll open this to any one of you who have thoughts on this, because what you just said, David, sort of struck a nerve, which is why should shame be the response to that? It seems like that is not a very good strategy for women.
I'd like to suggest generally that, basically, when a woman feels shame over being physically abused, I think it's she's reading this as, sort of a signal that, well, it could be viewed as a signal that she's made a very poor mate choice. And I think women do, as David mentioned. I mean, they make an effort, at least in the modern Western world, often to cover this evidence of a poor mate choice. Alternatively, I suppose it could be read as sort of evidence that her partner doesn't trust her, that maybe she did something in order to warrant this. But it is interesting, and there really hasn't been that much work on specifically on women's shame at having been physically abused.
Yeah, I think that leads to another interesting empirical question, and I don't know that anybody's done any work on this, but you mentioned that it might be a response to feeling like one made a poor mate choice. But as we know, in many parts of the world and in many societies, women don't make those choices.
Sure.
So an empirical question might be, do we see a different pattern in those societies where it's not a woman's choice who she's with, and she should, loudly and repeatedly announce that, she's got stuck with some horrible person. I don't know. Janet, I saw you nodding. Did you have a thought on that?
Well, I was just going to make the point that, that mate choice happens very differently in very different contexts, and that often it's a parental decision again, or an arrangement between two families, rather than it being the choice of a woman or a man as to who they end up marrying, and their marriage may be viewed very differently. There's maybe no expectation of romance or sexual attraction. It's a sort of contract of two families, between two families of convenience. So the emotions that might be involved could be very different. And I wouldn't know whether shame would be an emotion. I don't think likewise, as Todd was saying, I haven't seen much on the emotional response of a woman in these different contexts.
Well, sorry, go ahead, David.
No, go ahead.
No, please.
What I was going to say is that there is some empirical evidence, at least within Western cultures, that shame is a very predictable emotion experienced by women of IPV.
Sure.
But I think that just to add one more element, and this raises another kind of topic, getting back to Daniel Sneezer's hypothesis about the function of shame is, linked to social devaluation. And, women who, let's say, go out in public and people see the bruises and that she's been abused, would infer that their partner does not value them as much as they might. So they're socially devalued in that way. But also, this gets into the issue of female-female competition, where women often sort of on the positive side, and at least in the modern environment, do all kinds of resource display, designer handbags, and so forth. In part, in female intersexual competition, to say, I'm so highly valued by my mate that he buys me all this, all these luxury goods. And so I think that these issues might play into female intersexual competition, as well as if she is going to do any mate switching, the degree to which she's a high mate value woman, if she were to divest herself of her current mate and go out there. Well, if she's physically shows marks of physical abuse, that literally damages her physical appearance, which, given that we know about how men prioritize that in their mate selections, that's going to play into that. And so she's going to be perceived as lower in mate value, in addition to hampering her success in female-female intersexual competition.
Now, it seems like one of the questions is whether she can, whether airing the dirty laundry of what happens behind closed doors, whether that's more damaging to her reputation and her perceived mate value, or her partner. Because it seems that, this strategy of hiding it may be saving her face in terms of what her partner will do for her, but it's also doing him a lot of favors in hiding his strategies. So I think this issue of privacy and the degree to which people know what other people are doing is really important. Again, just anecdotally, I know that, you know, where I work in the Amazon, again, there's not a lot of privacy. Partner violence, intimate partner violence is quite prevalent. But women are also really open about it. There doesn't seem to be much level of shame about it. If I go and I interview women and I ask them about their husband, they will tell me, oh, he hits me, he does this. And I mean, he might be standing right there even. So I think, you know, this issue of the response of shame is, I think maybe a place that we could do some more digging and thinking about why we see shame in some contexts and not so much in others.
Yeah, and to extend that point, some women, at least in some cultures, at least ethnographically reported, say that it's a sign that her partner loves her so much. You know,
Yeah, I
so
wouldn't say that's true of where I work. They're not happy
yeah,
about it. They
yeah,
don't value it, but they're not
yeah,
embarrassed about it. They're not
yeah.
ashamed to tell you that this is what happens.
Yeah, well, that's why I think that the social norms around what is acceptable and what's not acceptable have to be weighed, have
Yeah,
to be factored in here.
I mean,
absolutely.
this isn't about the emotional response, but women's ability to leave a bad relationship
Right.
may very well direct how they respond to any IPV.
Right.
In many contexts, women simply don't have the opportunity to be able to leave because they have no alternative. And without the support of a kin network, you know, as we said, a marriage can be a contract in some of these places where bride wealth has been exchanged, dowry's been exchanged, it's a whole family thing. And a woman really doesn't have the opportunity to leave a bad relationship. So it may not be shame, it may just be that they literally have no alternative but to stay in that situation.
But so then again, I would push that a little bit and say, well, then what's our prediction in terms of that emotional response? Do we feel more of that emotional response of shame if we can leave and we're not because of all sorts of reasons why we don't? Or because it seems to me that, so for example, if I'm in a situation where my parents contracted this marriage, there's nothing I can do about it, I'm not ashamed of what's happening. I'm kind of pissed about it maybe, and and there's nothing I can do. Whereas, if we think about a society where there's more opportunities for a woman to leave, but again, we know there's all sorts of reasons why they don't, personal reasons, social reasons, all sorts of reasons, that maybe that's where they're more likely to express or feel shame. I don't really know. I just think this is an area that maybe we haven't looked at as deeply as we should. I actually also want to bring up another question that somebody posted here, and perhaps this will actually lead us to thinking about that a little bit more too, saying that romance novels, which are generally written by women for women, often feature some degree of intimate partner violence. And do we have any thoughts on why that might be? And again, I think that might be related to this issue of women's emotional response or strategic response to intimate partner violence. Todd?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I do have a comment on that. I mean, typically what you see in the romance novels, though, I mean, it's not the woman getting her teeth knocked out. It's some evidence that the man is so overcome with love or sexual desire that he, pushes her down, but, careful not to bust her head open on the table, and I think there are different signals involved. I mean, a similar argument can be made for, themes of sexual coercion. Once again, it's more a signal in the romance novels. It's much more typical for there to be, so the evidence or the signal is that he's so overcome with lust, specifically for her,
Right.
that he must have sex now. And again, it doesn't involve bashing her over the head or a lot more physically damaging sorts of indicators, but it does remind me of David's comment that for better or worse, it's an indication of how invested this guy is in this woman who he beats up. And I think that signal, the bruising and I think that's also read by other men as well as, maybe I don't want to get involved with this particular woman. She's got somebody, who's super invested, so much so that he's willing to physically assault her.
Right. And Todd's raises a really interesting issue there, and that is that, and back to Elizabeth's broader framing of the context of mate retention tactics in general, one tactic is directed toward potential mate poachers.
Right.
So, Todd and I found in our original studies, there's one sort of cluster where men will get his friends to go and beat up a potential mate poacher. And as Todd mentioned, the IPV may send a signal to deter other potential mates. If this guy has a reputation for reacting violently, that might deter potential mates, as do stalkers. It's one of the. It's another in a way. It's another form of IPV is stalking.
Right. No, I think that's a really important point because we don't actually see that as often listed as one of the adaptive motives for intimate partner violence is that signaling to other men. I think that's a really valid point and an important one. And again, goes back to that issue of the social context in terms of privacy and who's aware of what. So if it's a signal, if it's functioning at least in part as a signal, it does no good if nobody knows about it. Which then also might feed into why maybe women try and hide it as well. Boy, there's so many things to unpack here.
And everything's related to everything else.
I know.
in interesting ways, though.
Right. And I can't help but, like I said, I keep sort of going back and thinking about, my field work and the field context where I do work and the situations there. Because their lives are, so very different from ours here in terms of all of those things, the proximity of kin, the public nature of their lives, the amount of choice individuals have. Anyway.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Todd.
Go ahead, Todd.
Well, I was just going to comment that, there's the presumption in the modern Western world that it's morally wrong for a man to be physically and sexually abusive or aggressive against his partner, whereas it sounds like, well, no, it doesn't sound like it. I know it's not considered morally wrong. It's acceptable if, unfortunate, but there's nothing morally, wrong about it. I think that's a huge difference between, say, maybe the cultures where Janet has worked or where you have worked, and, in the modern Western world. I think there's a moral difference.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that goes back to, we talked about those social environments and not just norms, but also laws. And, I learned just recently, and I'm not going to dare myself to give an actual date because I'll be wrong because I'm terrible with dates. But I think it was in the 90s. It wasn't until the 90s that spousal rape became illegal in all 50 states. I mean, so I think that, that tells you a little something about even in modern Western environments, our perceptions of.
Can we not call it modern Western?
Yes, thank you.
Can we just call it Western or high-income country? Yeah, I mean, for whatever reason, and it's unclear, but the acceptability of IPV within a relationship does seem to be higher in some lower middle-income countries compared to high-income countries, and the reason for that is uncertain.
Yeah,
but,
well, I mean, even a modern example, it's not just those cultures. In Russia, there are no laws against IPV. And they don't even have things like restraining orders against husbands who beat up their partners. So,
could it be that women's lives are valued less in those places?
I think maybe it's a very patriarchal structure which just hasn't put in any laws for protection of women. But something that I keep thinking about when we're having this discussion is that, we're talking about IPV as a proxy for a demonstration of paternity concern, and actually without looking at whether it's to be able to really tell whether it's a successful strategy, we'd need to look at the reproductive success of men who perpetrate IPV compared to men who don't perpetrate IPV. And in order to do that, you'd need to look at genetic testing, because it's very difficult to tell the reproductive success and fitness of men, because they may father children outside of their relationship. They may be raising children who aren't their own, which they don't know. So it may, we're talking about IPV as being an adaptive response to paternity concern or these different evolutionary theories. And, it's something I am myself interested in as well. But I am concerned that it's sort of become accepted that, risk of paternity, of being cuckolded, or, however we're going to phrase it, is a adaptive response, IPV is adaptive response to that. And actually, it may be that these behaviors we're looking at don't improve a man's fitness. We don't know without looking at, without much more detailed, which is very difficult to do, because to look at, but there are quite a few studies now which have used different genetic methods. And it seems that the non-paternity rate is actually very low in many, I think it's like 1 to 2% estimated. So the fact that paternity concern is a huge driving factor for IPV, I'm not convinced about. And I go back to the point I've made before about it being context specific. In some cultures or contexts where paternal investment is high, it might be a strong explanatory factor for IPV. But in other contexts, say matrilineal contexts, or where paternal investment is low and men the concern about being raising someone else's kids is less because they're not really putting in the investment. It may be a very small factor in determining whether a man perpetuates IPV and all these other social factors which I've been talking about. Childhood experiences, watching mothers, whether the parents had a violent relationship, the social acceptability of violence within the community, alcohol use, all these things are maybe much more important than the evolutionary arguments we've been talking about today.
Well, I think, the evolutionary arguments have never been restricted to just paternity uncertainty and solving that problem. They've been involved in monopolizing all of the females' reproductively relevant resources. And I think those come to bear. I have a lot of comments on all the interesting things that you just said, but I want to just get one more thing on the table, because I realize we only have about 5 more minutes. And that's something that I think is critical to the psychological, warfare between males and females in these relationships. And that's the Toby Kosmides concept of welfare trade-off ratio. And I think this is a really important and underexplored, the internal regulatory variable. So how much value do you place on your partner's welfare relative to your own welfare? And I think one of the things that IPV does is it alters the victim's welfare trade-off ratio. That is, and women often say like, oh, I haven't been attentive enough. I haven't cleaned up the house enough. It's my fault because I haven't. And so they get to the point where their behavior is more and more and more controlled, where they're placing their welfare trade-off ratio is altered. So they're placing more and more and more importance on their partner's welfare relative to their own welfare. And I think manipulating this internal regulatory variable is actually one of the functions and one of the psychological processes by which the IPV has its effectiveness.
Thank you. You're right that we do only have a couple of minutes left. So I just wanted to follow up because on Janet's point about empirical assessments of male reproductive success in response to IPV. I think you're absolutely right that that's important and almost impossible to do. But there is some data, speaking of, you mentioned the Chimane data earlier, and there is some data from the Chimane that spouses of men who engage in intimate partner violence have higher fertility than those who have experienced less intimate partner violence. There is no intimate partner violence category. And then I want to follow up on what David was saying, and maybe we'll sort of finish off with this, is again thinking about those female counter adaptations, because you just talked about the way that violence, or whatever form of violence it is, changes the cost benefit structure for women so that they behave differently. They moderate their behavior. What counter adaptations might we expect that women should have in place to resist that modification of their behavior? So not just resist violence, but resist having their choices taken or altered. I'll just open that to any of you.
One of the things we can expect is that women may sometimes kill their partner. And when they do that, it's often in a way that places her at least possible risk. So the classic, when he's asleep, minimizing the risk of their own injury. But that is, that some large proportion of the husband or male partner killings of men by their partners are either done defensively or when he's otherwise unable to fight back. And unfortunately, this is often used against her. Right. He was sleeping. But of course, that's precisely the moment at which he's least likely to be able to counter that, that effort.
Yeah, I would add one more to the defense issue, and that is that IPV often emerges precisely when the woman is motivated to leave the relationship. And I think in that context, the IPV is like a last-ditch, desperate attempt to retain access to the woman's reproductively relevant resources. But part of her defense is a mate switching adaptation, and in some ways, the males who commit the IPV are responding to that mate switching adaptation.
Right.
And the mate switching is sometimes to a more formidable partner who himself can function as a bodyguard.
Right. Exactly. All right. Any last thoughts from any of our panelists?
No, thank you very much, Elizabeth. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, I do want to say, I want to bring up that there were lots of interesting comments and questions that we didn't get to, which we knew was going to happen. But one of them that I just noticed at the bottom of the chat that perhaps we can have a second roundtable at some point was thinking about, we didn't talk at all about intimate partner violence in same-sex couples. And we know that there are different patterns, and we know that we have to think about those differently from an adaptive perspective, because certainly the risk of cuckoldry isn't there. So I just want to leave us with that thought that was something that we left undiscussed, and hopefully in another venue we can have that discussion as well.
Yes, very interesting. Good idea.
All right. Well, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the participants. Thank you to Saeed and all of the organizers.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I would like
Thank
to
you.
thank you, Elizabeth, for moderating, and all of the speakers and everyone for being here. I would like to also note that our next event will be on the evolution of reputation. It will be on November 5th at 9 a.m. The announcement will be out soon. Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Take care.